Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to this second panel in this TEPSA pre-presidency conference organized here in Stockholm. Det hörs dåligt. That's a problem. Det hörs dåligt. Let's see. There is no, I think, that's beyond the scope of my knowledge. It works now? Let's see. Do you hear me now? Okay. Then I try again. Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to this panel, the second panel of today's conference here in Stockholm, the TEPSA UI Pre-Presidency Conference. My name is Göran von Sydow. I'm the director of SIEPS, the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies, an institute based here in Stockholm. And I have the privilege to moderate today's discussion. Here with me I have three panelists that will help us to understand the very broad topic on the future of the Union and its fundamental values. That's indeed not a small task, and I think it follows neatly on the very broad general discussion that we had in the first panel session here today, and I think many of the items that were touched upon in that discussion will be followed up here today. Before I introduce the speakers, I would just briefly outline a few thoughts on this panel and where we might be able to lead this discussion. And the first point is that today it's the December 1st, and 13 years ago today, there was a Swedish EU presidency held the last time around, and it also marks the day when the Lisbon Treaty entered into force on December 1st. And the Lisbon Treaty, as you know, it changes a lot in the architecture of the EU, but it also specifies the values that are enshrined in that treaty in Article 2, already mentioned in the opening remarks. And you all know this, of course, by heart already, what they actually say. But I thought I would, just as a reminder to myself, if no one else, read out what it actually says in Article 2. The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between men and women prevail. Now, indeed, that's a pretty long list. I'm not sure how many of these values we will actually be able to cover in this discussion, but I think at least two of them are worth specifically pointing out, and that has to do with democracy, which I think will be at the forefront of our discussion here today, both internally, when it comes to the European Union in itself, but of course also globally. Because actually, when you're looking across the globe, there are various ways of measuring the state of democracy. VDAM Institute at Gothenburg University, many of you know, they measure the situation across the globe, and in their latest report, it's basically as dark as it is outside in December Stockholm at 3 o'clock. It says that while by now all of the positive development that came after the end of the Cold War are basically disappearing, in the sense that you have many states across the globe that are moving in an autocratic or democratically backsliding, and that also include inside the European Union, with a number of member states whereby the situation for democracy, including the rule of law, are actually going in the wrong direction. So I guess one key element here is to think about both what happens within the European Union when it comes to the situation concerning liberal democracy, that is rule of law plus democracy, but also, of course, how the global surrounding concerns us. And to that latter point, it's also, of course, worth noting that it's a question that does not only relate to democracy in itself, but also to many other things when it comes to the global conditions, when it comes to competition in global world affairs, but of course also when it comes to security. As we know that democratic states tend not to invade or illegally try to start wars against democratic neighboring countries, it is of course also a security concern. And we know that by now, also within the European Union, we are working very heavily on those issues where it comes to defending democracy, including issues such as countering disinformation or cyber threats indeed. So that was just a way to outline a few of the items that I think we should try to cover here. the state of democracy in Europe, including those challenges of backsliding, the EU's toolbox when it comes to dealing with those challenges, the external dimension, that is how can the EU then act at the global level, and also perhaps, if we come to that, to discuss how then the EU could reform internally to meet these challenges. And to my help, I have three panelists here who will help to dive into these issues. Agnieszka Sadecka is assistant professor at the Institute for European Studies of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She has a long experience in researching issues such as democracy, but also the threat of populism to democracy. Maximilian Konrad is professor of political science at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik, and he has also researched democracy in various ways, and particularly, perhaps I should mention here, the notion of deliberation and how new forms of democracy are developed. Finally, Richard Youngs, he's a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at Carnegie Europe. And Richard has dealt with both EU's foreign policy, but also issues of democracy within Europe and internationally. And the panel will be structured as this. Panelists will make introductions to their own choice of placing their focus on specific issues. We will then have a small exchange among us, but I also already now want to invite you to contribute with questions and comments in this discussion. With that said, I'm now going to leave the floor first to Maximilian Konrad.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be in Stockholm. In an earlier life, I actually came to Stockholm quite often when I was doing my PhD in Lund, and then a lot of things in political science happen in the capital, of course. But that was quite a while ago, so it's really nice to be back here. I guess the main reason why we are on this panel is because of our research project that recently started on reclaiming liberal democracy in the post-factual age. That's a project, a Horizon Europe project, with a lot of partners actually from TEPSA. So actually I think the project is also quite well represented here. And I mean, I guess my contribution to this debate will be to say a few reflections about the impact of post-truth politics on liberal democracy. So basically in our project we're investigating the impact that disinformation has on liberal democracies, and then also trying to spell out what can be done in terms of policy making in order to address this challenge. I know I only have 6 to 8 minutes for this initial statement here, and I wrote down, let's say, 6 to 8 points that I really want to make, or at least that I want to introduce, and then we can return to some of them in the discussion afterwards. So that means that I have basically about 1 minute for each of these aspects. One thing that really saves me time is that Göran already mentioned something that I wrote down, because I wrote down Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty as well, because it's very important, I think. I mean, when we talk about what impact does something have on the fundamental values of the EU, to actually be clear on what actually constitute fundamental values of the EU. And that's, of course, not a blurry notion of this and that, but it is actually put down quite explicitly in the Lisbon Treaty, but also, of course, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So basically, I want to make a couple of points, and the first one is kind of on a terminological note, because very often when we talk about this kind of phenomenon, I mean the impact of disinformation on democracy, then we talk about disinformation and or post-truth politics. I want to make a very simple point in the beginning, that those two things, those two concepts should not be used interchangeably. For the very simple reason that I think disinformation is a fact. I mean, that occurs. I mean, it's just something that is connected to the way the information environment has developed. I mean, to the decline of quality media, to the decline of the institution of journalism, to the decline of trust in journalism and things like this, but then also the accompanying rise of social media. And I guess the rise of social media is something that we celebrated quite a lot in the beginning, but of course we've also come to the conclusion over time that, I mean, the impact of social media on democracy, on democratic deliberation, on participation isn't all that positive. Or at least it has a highly problematic potential, at least, that we see play out in notions such as post-truth politics. I do, however, think that disinformation is something that we can deal with in one way or the other. I mean, this is something that exists, and we can find solutions to it, or we can discuss solutions to it. But when we talk about post-truth politics, we actually talk about something much broader. And this is, for me, this is not the question of, I mean, is this actually a post-factual age that we're living in? If so, is it something new, or has it always been like this to some extent? That's a completely different discussion that I'm also, that I'd be more than happy to have with all of you. But I look at post-truth politics as something distinct, I mean, connected, but also distinct from disinformation in the sense that it refers to a development in political culture. And I really hope we're not there, and I hope we never get there, because I mean, if we end up in a post-truth political culture where basically the truth doesn't matter anymore, I think then we would have a real problem. But I mean, the basic point is that we need to distinguish these two things. I mean, the occurrence of false information, possibly deliberate spread of false information, and the kind of consequences that it has in terms of the way we look at well, politics and deliberation. Second point that I want to make is that there's an intimate link between post-truth communication and populism/authoritarianism. And that's, of course, a point that has been made quite a bit in the literature already. And I mean, some people, myself included, have started talking about post-truth populism because this link is so intimate. And I think this is actually something that we need to take into account when we discuss the impact that post-truth politics or that disinformation has on liberal democracy, for the very simple reason that we see this is not a coincidental connection between populism and post-truth politics or post-truth communication. Because I mean, again, if we look at, it'd be nice to have those fundamental values on the slide here, but I mean, if we look at what the fundamental values of the European Union are, which of course coincides with the fundamental values of the member states, then we would see those are actually exactly the things that populism or authoritarianism is basically after, right? So I mean, these are the values that are attacked by post-truth politicians, populists, authoritarians, and we see this play out in a lot of contexts, in a lot of national settings within the European Union. Third point that I want to make is that, I mean, as a consequence of this, we need to see the fundamental challenge that post-truth communication represents vis-a-vis liberal democracy. And this is at least also how we in the Reclaim project frame this issue. I mean, we're interested not necessarily only in the way or kind of the impact of disinformation, but I mean how it is an attack on liberal democratic values. And that's also why we've chosen this name Reclaim, because we think this is not something that disrupts or disturbs or interferes with democratic politics, but it is actually something that represents a fundamental challenge in the sense of we need to find ways to reclaim liberal democracy in the face of this basically onslaught. I mean, in terms of expressions, that would be the fourth point that I would make. I mean, post-truth politics is something that expresses itself in the rejection of various forms of expertise. I will get back to this in relation to a point that I'm going to make about civic education or citizenship education. That is, I mean, there's a number of authors that are already talking about an epistemic crisis of democracy, in the sense that we seem to no longer have a general agreement on how we actually arrive at facts. I mean, how do we know that something is a fact and something else is not? And this has something to do quite fundamentally with, I would argue, something along the lines of a lack of understanding of what the scientific method actually is. I mean, how we use scientific methods in order to arrive at facts. But of course, this is also connected to I mean, to other aspects. I mean, there's a general decline in lack or in trust, for instance, in institutions like journalism, which we see play out in relation to aspects such as, you know, Donald Trump calling quality media fake news or liar press in the German context, or I think PK-Maffian is a slogan that is often used in Sweden to denounce journalists. I do want to make the point about solutions. So, I mean, there I would like to basically make the point that this is a problem that has to be dealt with in terms, at least to some extent, that has to be dealt with in terms of citizenship education. That's also one of the declared aims of the Reclaim project. But this doesn't only refer to aspects such as media literacy or source criticism, even though those are really, really central and very important skills to have in order to basically give citizens the tool in order to make up their mind on their own, or to figure out what is correct information, what is incorrect information. And by that, I'm obviously not making, I hope it's obvious, that I'm not making the argument that, you know, somebody, there has to be an instance, an authority that tells people this is correct, this is incorrect. No, I mean, it's obviously much more in a liberal democracy about giving citizens the skills to basically become fact checkers on their own. This is often referred to as civic online reasoning, that is giving citizens the tools with which they can make those kinds of decisions themselves. But it is, of course, also something more fundamental about the way we teach science in schools, right? I mean, to basically give students in schools an understanding of, well, how do we know what is a fact, and how do we know that something else is not a fact? How do we understand that, well, this is actually something that is based on research? So something along those lines. I think I'll stop here. I also have a couple of points more about kind of the disintegrative effect of disinformation on democratic societies, but I'm sure that's also going to come up in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maximilian, for that outline of several important points that we will come back to. Now I'm going to immediately leave to you, Agnieszka, for introduction.
Okay, thank you. It seems that we are all quite methodical in our approach, because we all started with the Article 2, and this is what I've done as well, to kind of take stock of the state of these values as listed. We agreed that I will talk about democratic backsliding, since I've been studying the populism in Poland and Hungary primarily. Our team was focusing mostly on the cultural dimension. And these countries are especially interesting to look at, of course, because these are the countries where the populists are in power, and of course the longer those right-wing populist parties are in power, the more effects of backsliding we can observe. In the words of Bustikova and Guasti, we could say it's no longer just some kind of a swerve, a liberal swerve, but it is a liberal turn that we are dealing with, probably. Of course, in Poland, we already are at 2 terms, in Hungary at the 4th term of Viktor Orban. So we can see that this may mean that this democratic backsliding is more permanent. We can assume. So when it comes to these 6 key values that are mentioned in Article 2, we observe quite worrisome dimensions of each of them, perhaps. When it comes to rule of law, obviously, we see the limiting of the independence of the judiciary, we see the questioning of the supremacy of the EU law by several politicians. We also see the non-compliance with the European Court of Justice rulings, which, of course, result in some fines and quite serious consequences. This also means that we observe more of a anti-EU or Eurosceptic rhetoric as a response in those countries. We also see a decline in democratic standards in the sense of, for instance, the blurring of the separation of powers, the kind of emphasis on the executive. The pandemic also, in a way, made it more clear as this kind of ruling by decree or ruling by some special form was possible. We also see anti-pluralism, which is another important element. Different attempts to eliminate diversity of opinions, to eliminate opposition also at key positions at different public institutions. The takeover of state institutions, including, for instance, the cultural institutions, museums, changes in education curricula, and so on, can also be observed. Another element that probably relates to what Maximilian said is this kind of a declining role of experts, of expertise. We see that sometimes loyalty to the party is more important than expertise and meritocracy. We also observe, especially during the pandemic, certain politicians and governments, related opinion makers toying with conspiracy theories. We've seen different ones, of course, including not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but also Donald Trump. I guess we all know his different strange opinions about how to fight with coronavirus. We also observe some challenges to the freedom, to various freedoms. Freedom of expression, as in the control of media that we already discussed, but also the freedom of assembly that has been kind of challenged, particularly in the time of pandemic. We've seen quite a lot of repressive actions towards activists trying to protest. For instance, the women's protests in Poland have been quite strongly kind of marked in negative ways. One of the right-wing magazines has accused the women protesters of being the sowers of death for daring to protest during the pandemic. Also, of course, the civil society is being kind of sort of challenged. Many activists, especially LGBT activists, face certain repressions for their actions in Poland, at least. And we also observe another challenge to another value, which is the value of respecting human rights. So we can think of pushbacks that happen in the Mediterranean, but also those in the Polish-Belarusian border, which stand in contradiction to international law and the right to demand asylum. And of course, in the case of Belarus, this is a much more complex issue, more geopolitical. Migration is, of course, weaponized in that case. But still, the fact that the Polish border guards, belonging to the EU, on the EU external border, push families with children back to forest in freezing temperatures, endangering their life, essentially, is a serious violation of human rights, in my opinion. Also, what is quite striking is that the populist governments tend to penalize human solidarity and providing aid in such cases to asylum seekers, as it was the case to both in Hungary and in Poland. So there are several issues that we can take into account. Perhaps we can think together about some explanations and think of perhaps some remedies and some things to consider in the future.
We'll certainly do that. Thank you so much, Agnieszka, in the discussion. And thanks for outlining all of these sort of the conditions that we've witnessed over the last few years. Now I'm going to leave over to Richard for your first intervention.
Yeah, actually the last comment leads on to what I was going to focus on. Agnieszka and Maximilian have given us a good diagnosis of the problems, of the challenges. It's quite clear that the starting point in terms of democracy is worrying. both inside the EU and globally. Whether it's quite as uniformly as bleak as some of the indices paint it as, I think is debatable. The data is questioned and contested on this, but clearly the challenges are very severe. For me, the big debate is whether the EU can do anything better to hold at bay these threats and this democratic backsliding. And for me, the significant thing is that after so many years of us debating these kinds of problems, still the EU doesn't really have a toolbox capable of dealing with these democratic risks and problems. Having said that, this year we've seen an unprecedented range of new policy initiatives introduced by the EU. In part due to the war in Ukraine, the EU has developed a whole new narrative around supporting democratic values. The link between internal and external democracy problems is there abundantly clear now, thanks to what's happened in Ukraine. It is clear that the EU can't hope to support democracy successfully internationally if it doesn't do more within its own borders, and vice versa. If it doesn't do more internally, it's not going to have the credibility to have a successful external policy. A lot has been done. It's not just the issue of Hungary and rule of law conditionality. I mean, to follow up on the previous panel, my hunch would be on that we will see a resolution that is kind of half transactional, half based on principles in both countries. So the EU's got a little bit more critical, a little bit more engaged on core rule of law standards. In neither of those two countries is the focus on democratic quality in its broadest sense, which is still a shortcoming. But it's not just about the rule of law mechanism. This year, the Commission has started a whole new funding program on democratic values in the EU for the first time, spending about 1.6 billion euros across Europe on democracy problems, recognizing you can't bring democracy to bear just by conditionality, that you need to build up local democratic capacity across different member states. So things are starting to move. Perhaps the big disappointment of the year was the Conference on the Future of Europe that promised a whole democratic renovation in Europe, didn't really deliver anything very concrete. You probably all know it has resulted in a few so-called citizen panels, modest ways of engaging citizens in EU decision-making, but it hasn't as yet made a qualitative breakthrough. For me, that relates to something which is very, very interesting, that there is a lot of democratic energy emerging across Europe. It's very local, it's very community-based. Often it's based around kind of citizen assemblies and these kind of initiatives that are pioneered in Iceland and Ireland and other countries, but it's not linked to the EU level. And for me, the big challenge for the EU is to kind of harness this local level democratic energy and make it mean something political at the EU level, because at the moment it does not. So I think that in all this sense, there's a lot of innovation. It is not an era of political apathy. There is engagement, but it's not really at the moment holistically joined together in a way that would have a big political impact. I also think next year will be a year where the focus will not just be on Poland and Hungary, but also on new challenges. I wondered if in the previous panel we got perhaps a slightly overly positive view of Sweden representing democratic values, when we're standing in a place where a lot of the population has just voted for a really radical far-right party, where that far-right party holds the strings of many government decisions. We know what's happened in Italy. Sweden and Italy, I think, are test cases. Academics have long debated about how much of a systemic threat the far-right represents to democracy. We're about to see this tested, whether their inclusion, formal or informal, is likely to have any impact in their democratic credentials. There's not much debate on this at the moment in the EU, and I think this will become a real challenge. And then I would finish off by saying just 2 words on the external front, because I think here we see a big game change, a big sea change in 2022 because of Ukraine. All the foreign policy rhetoric is on the EU needing to do much more to defend democratic values, but still with limited progress. You will all know that after the invasion started, a lot of the strategic narrative was around coalitions of democratic states having to fight back against authoritarians. In practice, we are not seeing this neat division between a democratic world and an authoritarian world. The geopolitics of the Ukraine conflict is much messier. They are much more eclectic than this. Despite all the rhetoric that the EU has developed around democracy, the EU this year has done more deals with authoritarian regimes than it has ever done. Many of them related to trade, many of them related to energy. The latest episode is Uzbekistan, where Borrell just visited to launch a whole new policy on connectivity. So for me, conceptually, there's a big paradox here that in the name of defending democratic values that are at risk in Ukraine, the EU is doing a lot of deals, more than it has ever done, with non-democratic regimes. That's a messy geopolitics that I think clouds the clarity of the EU's geopolitical message. I could say a lot more on the detail of EU external democracy support, but I'll leave with one thought, which is the one potential qualitative game changer in external democracy support could come from accession, because accession, I think, is the tool that can link together the big geopolitics of democracy with more effective on-the-ground operational support for democracy, the kind of unsexy stuff that doesn't really get into the political headlines. So this is positive, and in the 3 countries that have been offered either candidate status or a perspective, you can see governments at least promising reforms that had been atrophied, that were stalled since the offer was made in June. So you can see some of the leverage being brought to bear. But as we all know, as Roderick mentioned in the previous debate, the leverage of accession over democracy is finite. If the momentum isn't kept going, it will not work as a tool for democracy support. That will undermine the democratic message of the EU externally, and also I think undermine the credibility of its democratic policies internally as well. So there's a kind of opportunity there on accession, I think, to qualitatively upgrade support for democracy, but I'm not sure yet it's an opportunity the governments will take.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, and that's a lot to think of, and I think we're going to come back indeed to the internal dimension and the toolbox, what the EU actually can do. But let me just start where, towards the end, when you talked about the external dimension, and you said that it's geopolitically messy what the EU is doing, Richard, and all of those deals with autocratic regimes. But then, what would you then suggest? I mean, how should we engage, given the fact that the world, the way it looks, also is consisting of many of autocracies, and that direction is going? So what would you think then for the EU to engage with those states?
I'll just make 2 points that a lot of the international politics of democracy have been refashioned by Ukraine, but Ukraine is not the only story in town. So this year we've seen protests in many countries, either dislodge governments or put them on the back foot: Kazakhstan, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Iran. In all these cases, the European engagement has been a little bit ambivalent, a little bit lukewarm. So we all know Ukraine is the priority. But one recommendation I would make would be not to let the focus on Ukraine, as necessary as this is, distract attention from other developments in democratic politics around the world. Ukraine is not determining everything to do with democracy around the world. Many of the drivers and the inhibitors of democratization in other parts of the world have nothing to do with what's happening in Ukraine, or are only indirectly, very indirectly related to events in Ukraine. And I think the EU should not be distracted either diplomatically or divert too many of its resources away from these very pressing political challenges in other parts of the world. And then finally, I would say this, that there's democracy support functions at 2 levels conceptually for me. One is the big geopolitics of democracy. This has to do with a lot of coordination that's going on now between democratic states that wasn't going on before. It's not absolute, it's not complete, because the EU is also going softer on China. It's reaching new deals with other authoritarian regimes. So it will not be the only organizing principle of international relations, but it will, it seems to me, play a more significant role. But there's a whole other level level of democracy strategy that isn't very geopolitical, that is not related to these big political developments. And there things have changed during the last year. The EU is just introducing a whole range of new funding. It's changing the way that it engages with local democratic actors. So the kind of micro level of democratic politics is changing, and that requires a new strategy of engagement from the EU, quite separate from the big politics that we're facing with Russia, Ukraine, China, and other really geopolitical challenges.
Interesting. Now, we've all mentioned Article 2, I think, in this context, sort of the foundation and the fundamental values. But of course, to deal with that, it is, as many of you have pointed out, there are some serious challenges. At the same time, the EU is funded by the member states themselves being democratic, and that's also actually within the treaty stated that there's a respect for the national identity, and of course that also puts the limits on EU action in certain cases. Now, you have outlined the sort of situation and the problems that arise, but I think we should perhaps dive in a little bit more than what to do about it and the EU's toolbox. Richard has said that there is no proper toolbox. Others would argue, well, indeed, we have over the last few years actually tried to develop something at the EU level, even though it's not entirely successful. We saw yesterday, for instance, the news, and which was also mentioned in the previous panel, about the withholding of EU funds, for instance, in this context. But can I please ask you to a little bit elaborate, what would you see as the most important tools that you think the EU should be equipped with, and how to use them in the best way in order to remedy the problems? Can I start with you, Agnieszka?
Yes, I would refer maybe to what Richard said on this micro level of democratic politics, because I think it's very important that the civil society is strengthened, and this also has to do with funding, that funding does not only go to member states, but also goes directly to civil society organizations. That could be kind of a practical recommendation. Definitely more diversity of funding, for instance, of cultural institutions, is also helpful, because if they are funded only from public sources, in the moment of a takeover by, let's say, populist actor, then of course we have a very quick turn. So if there is a diversity of funding, that is also very helpful and ensures more independence. Maybe that's just a couple of things off the top of my head.
Yeah, thank you. Maximilian, what do you say?
Great question, but also just a very, very big question. So I think, when we're thinking about the EU's toolbox and solutions to problems or fixes to problems, of course, we need to ask, which of the problems are we actually referring to? Because we touched on quite a broad range of different topics, and if we take this at the macro level, the aspect of democratic backsliding, of course, then Article 7, which we haven't explicitly referred to, or maybe we have. That's of course an important tool to have. But of course, there are questions underneath that. Like, how do you basically go around having that kind of problem? How do you make sure that states don't backslide? There's the aspect, as Richard mentioned, of course, of conditionality in the accession process. That's of course a super important thing, and maybe that's not the most recent literature, but this was always pointed out as the most successful EU foreign policy instrument. The carrot of membership and the kind of role that it plays in democratization. But just as Richard has also said, that momentum needs to be kept up, and that's not a given that it does. But I think the underlying question is has something to do at the micro level with popular attitudes, right? So basically, how does kind of talk about democratic consolidation transfer into the minds of people individually? And that's a much bigger question. And I think that's where it connects to this aspect of disinformation, post-truth politics, and things like this. And truth be told, I'm often wondering about this myself, to what extent we are actually managing to focus on the source of the problem, and to what extent we're thinking about symptoms or expressions of this problem. And that's also the point, in a sense, that I was trying to make in relation to the what I was saying in my introductory statement. that I mean we need to basically arrive at let's put it this way. I mean, the point that I was trying to make in the introductory statement is that, I mean, we do see this link between post-truth politics and populism, and we need to understand this link because, I mean, the kind of politician that engages in post-truth communication is also the one that is fundamentally gunning for the kind of fundamental rights that the EU is based on. And of course, I mean, then the question is, I mean, to what extent do strategies for dealing with the challenge of disinformation actually help to deal with the problem that might very well be just simply authoritarian attitudes in the first place? And this is of course very problematic. And there I think, I mean, if you're thinking in terms of solutions, I mean, what does the EU have in its toolbox? Well, I think, I mean, if you look at I mean, for instance, the call for proposals in this round of Horizon Europe funding that we got the grant for, I mean, this is testimony to the fact that that we need to know much more, right? I mean, that we have some vague ideas about the kind of challenges that we're dealing with. But sure, I mean, there are certain policy initiatives, but there's also apparently a need for much more research that is expressed in the kind of research that the EU wants scholars to engage in, that the EU wants to develop knowledge on. I mean, in our project, I mean, we place emphasis, for instance, on this aspect of citizenship education. Again, I mean, I'm not really sure if that, I mean, I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful that this will help us contribute to solving the problem. But of course, it's, I mean, that's a question that's up for debate. But like I said before, I mean, it is something that has to do not just with dealing with disinformation and basically every citizen becoming a fact checker in their on their own, but it also has, maybe much more fundamentally, has to do with basically instilling democratic values in citizens. And the point that I was also trying to make before, I mean, why this is a challenge to liberal democracies, maybe not something that we've made explicit, but it should be made explicit. Because you can say, well, you know, a lot of things are justifiable by reference to democracy, but the same things are not justifiable by reference to liberal democracy. So, I mean, we need to make that qualification that, I mean, we're talking about liberal democracy, and by liberal, I basically mean all the kind of rights and values that we associate with, well, basically what is expressed in the fundamental values of the European Union as well.
Sure. And that's indeed something that has become more clear, at least in contexts like in the Swedish one, where we are quite unusual for us to think in terms of liberal democracy. It has now become this sort of standard mark that this is how we understand it, only that maybe it was more understood as taken for given, the other part, the liberal part of it. But of course, that's something that has come to the fore. Now, I'm now going to start looking out, so please start waving to me when you want to pose questions or comments. But before that, Richard, do you also want to be a little bit more constructive in this discussion?
More constructive. I thought I was being the constructive one. I was so in terms of practical,
I had that impression too.
Practical suggestions, I would say very practical. I would say money. That this is the year when every single European leader's speech tells us that democracy is in existential crisis, that because of what's happening in Ukraine, this is a moment of absolutely pivotal change, of self-survival. But the money they're putting into it doesn't suggest, is not at that level. It's just not at that level. Germany can put 100 billion into a new defense package. The amount governments spend on democracy is more in the tens of millions. So there's a difference between Europe defending itself and Europe defending democratic values. And at the moment, it's just, to my mind, it's not, governments are not putting the resources into defending democratic values that suggest it is really their priority. It's priority number 5 or 6 or 7. So a lot more can be done really to match the level of rhetorical commitment. And then I would say, I don't want to sound naively idealistic. European governments will need to engage with authoritarian regimes. The geopolitics is messy, and it will be. So I think the European governments and the EU collectively need to learn to how they do strategic engagement, very realpolitik engagement with non-democratic regimes, but at the same time carve out a space to engage with civic actors and pro-democratic actors at the same time, and for the EU not to kind of undersell its own leverage in doing that. There'd be practical suggestions, which relates to one kind of more conceptual academic point I would make, is that over the last decade, all the narrative, the analytical narrative, has been so unremittingly negative and bleak about democracy that I think there's a danger of the EU getting into a mindset of thinking anything it does on democracy is so fundamentally against the grain of what people want that it's almost not worth doing. I think that then the caution in European democracy policy almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The situation with global democracy is serious, but there's a lot of more positive developments going on at the same time that policy developments, policy initiatives can lock onto.
Before I go out to the questions, there was something also you mentioned, Richard, in your first remark about missing the opportunity of what would be sort of this democratic energy that you find at the grassroots, and you're concerned with the limited interest in this conference on the future of Europe. Now, that of course it's also brings me, at least being more of a researcher in terms of political parties, and would you also think that there is sort of should be more of innovation in terms of how we think about democracy, generally speaking, about representative democracy, and perhaps also you saying how could that engagement be connected to EU level? How do you foresee that? How do you see sort of making that connections better work within the EU from the grassroots engagement up to the European level? Do you see that?
So I mean, that's a huge question of political philosophy. I would say in practice there is the developments in democratic innovations are rather leaving political parties outside. All the exciting energy is about different direct forms of engaging citizens in politics. Many of these innovations are defined and framed almost as almost in hostility to existing representative party-based democracy. So it seems to me that parties need to defend themselves if they're going to retain some stake, some place in the future of liberal democracy. But I think the debate is open now as to whether our future democracy will be a democracy based on representation through political parties.
Or other forms. Well, thank you. That's indeed a different broad topic. Now I have a few questions. There is one here. Yes, you can take that one first, and please state your name briefly.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for your fascinating presentations. My name is Alla Leukovets. I'm a research fellow at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. I would like to ask a question about the future of Eastern Partnership. There is now a lot of talk on what to deal with this, how to deal with this initiative. So are you in favor of keeping it or somehow changing it? And also specifically to Richard, you mentioned that the EU should try to strategically engage with authoritarian regimes. Do you think there is a room for this strategic engagement with Lukashenko regime? Thank you. In Belarus.
We try to take that one, and then we go to the other ones. Would you want to start, Richard? On the
we had a debate on this last night on the Eastern Partnership. There are people in the room who know more about this than I do. For me, the Eastern Partnership is more or less dead. I mean, the EU will not admit that and say there's still a regional dimension, but I think in terms of Belarus, that a lot of the main substance of policy now will be delivered more on a bilateral basis, on a individual basis with Belarus. I think with Belarus, the EU has actually pioneered some quite interesting ways of keeping engagement going with civil societies. You know, it's a whole new layer, a whole new type of civil society than existed in Belarus 10 years ago, where most European support was going to fairly formally organized political opposition. That's not the case now. I would say that the challenge in Belarus is a different one. That is the exiled opposition is getting a lot of support from many European governments. I think the challenge is to make sure that exile community keeps in contact with people on the ground in Belarus that represent a qualitatively new form of civic engagement. Because the lesson from Burma, Syria, Libya and other places is when you support is too focused on exiled democratic communities, that can actually make democratization more difficult to achieve.
Does anyone of you want to jump in on this question as well? Then we have several others, so it's we can start over there, please.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Vicky Cariotti. I am a postdoctoral researcher at UI, and I'm going to start with, well, I'm starting with something that Richard said, but please feel free, all of you, to answer if you want. I'm wondering if this sort of dealing with non-democratic regimes, if we don't do that, if the European Union decides to stay away from that, doesn't that create a catch-22 where if you engage with it, you might be blamed that you're not following your own values or that you're supporting a regime that is actually not what you are trying to build in your own area, while at the same time, if you withdraw any cooperation or deals, you might cause the situation where they will build on spreading the narrative that you're isolating them, that you don't respect their own values. We've seen that happen with Azerbaijan, for example, and then what happens is that they turn towards their own, sphere of influence. We know which country I'm talking about that happens to be there. But yeah, so that is my question really. How does one balance this catch-22 where you don't want to appear that you are violating your own values while at the same time you don't want to cause more isolation of these regimes, because we also need to remember that regimes don't necessarily mean all of the population. There are groups in these countries that do not support, you know, the authoritarian regime, and we might actually inadvertently punish these groups that exist in these countries. Thank you.
Excellent question. Maybe we collect one more. August is there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is August Danielsson. I'm a PhD student at Uppsala University. I have a question about money, also, as Richard brought up. And I'm thinking that, I mean, today the EU has, at least to some degree, some potential ability to export their values through market power. But if we look, I guess, very far into the future, 2050, the prognosis for the EU's sort of global share of GDP will, of course, decrease quite substantially. So I'm wondering, how will the EU's ability to export their values have to develop, I guess, in the future, if we look, again, quite far into the future? Thanks.
Excellent, and I think they are very related. So we take these two questions. One is about the engagement with non-democratic regimes, and the other one is the forecast about the diminishing role and how to maintain then what one could think of in terms of normative power Europe and the projection of European values. Do you want to start, Maximilian?
Sure. Great questions. Also very nice, because I kind of have the feeling that, you know, I'm talking a lot about, you know, things that characterize democracy at the domestic level. And I mean, one of the things that I'm struggling with in our own project is that, I mean, we need to connect this kind of to the international dimension and also kind of more to EU politics. And I think it's a super interesting and important question that you're asking. And I mean, just kind of a reflection. I mean, I think it's very easy now in 2022 to say, well, you know, mistakes were made 20 years ago. I mean, which is completely obvious by now. Like, I mean, there's been a lot of Germany bashing so far, and I mean, that's of course, I mean, that's clearly well deserved. I mean, when the decision was made to go for Nord Stream 1 and then later for Nord Stream 2, you know, to build on the relationship with Russia. I mean, it was not only about gas; it was also about using trade. I mean, reflecting basically very basic IR theory, using trade as a way to build stable partnerships and build relationships between countries. And of course, I mean, now looking back, I mean, seems like everybody was completely wrong about this, especially the German government that decided to go that way, right? I mean, that's clearly easy to say today, and also kind of the insistence to stick to this kind of cooperation. But I mean, of course, it is the question. I mean, what should you do instead? And I mean, I think this also reflects, I mean, a debate that maybe we're not thinking very much about anymore, which was, I would argue, I mean, the debate on the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. I mean, that's not something we've heard very much about in recent years. Why? Because it's dead. why is it dead? Well, not only because of Donald Trump, but also because it was fundamentally contentious in Europe. And I mean, when this was being debated, a lot of people said, well, we need to have this. Because I mean, if Europe wants to have a say in the world and wants to play a role in global politics, and we need to have that kind of solution. Because what if, I mean, if we don't want to trade with the US because, you know, they have chlorine chicken and this and that, they're just going to look somewhere else. They're going to go with China, right? So, I mean, it is a very important question. I mean, and so, I mean, the same basically also played out at the, I mean, in the German debate about, well, you want to buy the cheap T-shirts from China, but you also have to accept, or maybe you should not buy the cheap T-shirts from China because you want to emphasize your, human rights. You want to promote human rights and things like this. So this is clearly not a simple question. I'm not sure if I'm starting to ramble, but
no, I think if two small things. I think there were, of course, people who already were seeing this problem with the Nord Stream, and secondly, here in the audience, there's someone who I think is very well knowledgeable about the TTIP negotiations that we can have over coffee later on. Now, could you make short, because I have several people who want to jump in as well. Could you?
Yeah, just a quick comment to maybe address this question about exporting values through market only, right? So I think that perhaps at the danger of sounding a bit too idealistic, I think the EU definitely needs a kind of a story about itself. And it's also about cultural diplomacy, about kind of this external image. And I think that paradoxically, this war in Ukraine also shows the EU as much more united and shows this value of solidarity as such. So perhaps it will, in a way, contribute to the more positive image overall, together with other initiatives such as the European Green Deal and so on.
Richard.
So for me, the EU has to engage with non-democratic regimes. There's only about 20 fully democratic regimes in the world today, so we don't really have a strategic choice. Russia's a different matter. I don't think there can be any prospect of kind of re-engaging with Russia, but that's not because Russia's authoritarian, that's because of what's happening in Ukraine. But there are ways of doing strategic engagement and keeping some channels open to pro-democratic actors or civil society actors. Turkey is a good example. Senem might want to come in because that's a case where the EU's basically taken the money away from the state and given it to civil society. For me, the big area of engagement in the future will be climate, where the EU is pumping billions and billions and billions of euro into partnerships with non-democratic regimes is on climate. And it might be a reasonable conclusion that climate is a lot more important than human rights and democracy. But the amount of funding going into climate is many, many, many times greater than anything the EU does on human rights. So it seems to me that can be an access point for the EU to work with local actors on rights-based initiatives that are part of this climate support in the future. Then on funding, I agree, in the future, neither Europe nor the US will have the funding nor the percentage of the share of trade sufficient for them to support democracy without the support of other democracies around the world. So democracy support will only retain traction, it seems to me, if it's more multilateralized in the future. And that has actually been a lot of the area of debate in the wake of the Ukraine conflict this year.
Thank you. Now I have questions over there. Two actually next to, so we can take the two. Thank you.
Thank you, Göran. Paul Schmidt from the Austrian Society for European Politics. I wanted to say that I think many of us would agree with your diagnosis, your analysis of the developments, at least I do, but we always spend a lot of time on the diagnosis, and I would be more interested in your utopian or realistic remedies of the situation or the developments that you see. One or two were mentioned already, the question of citizenship education. So how would that actually work? Would you like to, for example, take public education out of the new fiscal rules which we're going to reform? What would you propose to politicians on the funding issue? I think the funding is a very valid issue, but how would you, it's easier said than done to fund local initiatives, administer it, control it, conditionality, et cetera. Can that really be done on an EU level? What about the role of the member states in particular in terms of external action? There should be one line to take in order to fight certain narratives. So what are your concrete tangible proposal. For example, Maximilian, would lowering the voting age be a way to go? Would you want to see more media literacy? Not everyone has to be a journalist, but
Thank God.
what would we? Thank God, yeah. Let's forget about free media, no? No, but what are your concrete proposals on this? Even if they're utopian, whatever, I think it would take us one step further. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Utopia. You can pass the mic to Jakob, who's next to you.
Yeah, actually, Jan, you already asked the question I was going to ask, so I'll pass up.
You repeated the point, stress the importance of the
I'll
question.
stress the importance. No, it was very interesting to hear. I mean, hopeful what Richard said about this. That you can see this energy in sort of democratic engagement on a local level or in sort of new levels, new areas. I represent the Swedish Parliament in Brussels. And so I'm, of course, interested in sort of parliamentarism and representative democracy and sort of the crisis of democracy. Is it really a crisis of parliamentarism, or is it? I mean, can you? Yeah, it would be interesting to hear a bit more reflections about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Could you just pass the microphone across the aisle and thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Tale Kandal. I'm from the Norwegian Embassy, so I'm not an academic like a lot of you seem to be. Thank you for interesting interventions. I have actually two totally different questions or comments. The first one is, you were talking, several of you, I think, were talking about this full pull factor of membership in the EU for democratization, making countries more democratic because they have the carrot of becoming members. But the past, 10 years, no new members have been accepted, even though there have been negotiations with several of the Balkan countries. And it took years before some of the Balkan countries received candidate status. So do you think that this will now, because of what's happening in Ukraine, because of the EU, as far as I can see, is also becoming more or acting more in solidarity, as was the word used, that this will help for that the countries, that the accession processes will be more not so long-winded, and thereby not not stopping the reforms in the accession countries because everything is going so slow, so that the hope of there is backsliding because things take such a long time. That's one part. And the second thing is, you're also talking about this civic education. There was a very interesting article in one of today's Swedish newspapers, either Dagens Nyheter or Svenska Dagbladet, I don't remember which, about a report which has just come out about school children in Sweden, and that they do not really know this division of power thing, that the executive shouldn't mix in the judiciary. And I mean, Sweden, I think, sees itself and is a very long-standing democracy with long traditions of democracy. So I found it a bit surprising that the results were as dismal as they were in the understanding of how democracy works and what is the rule of law and what is the state of things like that. So that would also be interesting if you could say a bit more about how can we remedy such things also in countries like the Nordics, these long-standing beacon-like democracies, at least we like to think that we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As these are great questions, but we're running a little bit out of time, and I have at least 3 other hands. Maybe if you're okay with this, panelists, we collect all of them and then we wrap it up. So at the very far end, there is a gentleman and also his neighbor. They can ask questions, and then there is on that side as well one question. And if you can try to be relatively brief, it's much appreciated.
Hello, I'm Brendan Donnelly from the Federal Trust in London. A few years ago, if we'd had a panel about democracy in the European Union, people would have been talking about the European Parliament and majority voting and what needed to be done to make the European Union more democratic in its structures. That isn't what you've been discussing. Can you say why? Is it not an interesting debate anymore? Or doesn't it matter? Or is there nothing to be done about it? And then the other brief observation is that geopolitics by its nature is messy. You can't have geopolitics without messiness. And particularly in Europe of the 20th century, when you had the Second World War, when one totalitarian state was defeated by another one with the help of the democracies, and the democracies then acquiesced for 50 years in that totalitarian state enjoying the fruits of its conquest. It all seems really rather straightforward compared with that now, it seems to me.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. My name is Funda Tekin. I'm from Institut für Europäische Politik in Berlin. I have one question also with regards to the export of fundamental values, and that relates also more to trade or well, global trade basically, and this is or investment. It's the global gateway strategy, which is also kind of has the idea of countering the Belt and Road Initiative of China, and also applying a well, values-based approach, and whether that would also be, according to your assessment, a solution to exporting the values. And more like a comment also to Paul, because you were mentioning lowering the voting age in terms of maybe as part of the solution. But we did a study also in at IEP where we looked at well, preferences for liberal values in the Middle and Eastern European countries, and there we actually found out that the younger generation is not necessarily more liberal than the older ones. So maybe this might not be the full solution to the problem.
Thank you so much. And then the last question, which is in the middle there, Jakob.
Oh. Okay, thanks. I'll try to be brief. You were talking about toolboxes, and does this work? Yeah. And Richard and Agnieszka said the word idealistic, so I'll have to say materialistic now for the sake of balance. When you talk about disinformation and the toolboxes to combat it, it's intrinsically linked to national populism and reactionary politics, as you were mentioning at the beginning. I'd like to come back to that. I mean, is it meaningful to approach the politics of disinformation from another angle? I mean, are we looking at the real thing here if we're talking when talking about measures? Since disinformation thrives in the already existing cleavages of socioeconomic and demographic cleavages in our societies, isn't that where we're supposed to look at in terms of, I mean, whether or not political disinformation exists as a commodity? This will take root where there's fruitful ground, if you know what I mean. So, I mean, what does that leave us? Does it leave us with social Europe? Is that where we are?
Yes, thank you so much. I will try to, it's impossible, but try to summarize a little bit of all these brilliant questions that came in. We are encouraging the panelists to be more concrete and utopian, right? So please think of something both utopian and perhaps something concrete as well. We would like to also think in terms of democratic renewal, how that takes place within existing or new forms. We'd like also the panel to consider enlargement at the pace of enlargement, but also the role of civic education and knowledge about democracy. Now, there is also a question about why shouldn't we talk more about the EU in itself being more democratic? And that's to blame me, the moderator, because I had it as my fourth item, but I failed apparently to bring this into the discussion. So I take that one on me. And also the perspective that geopolitics is indeed messy, and related to that, the question of the global gateway and the export of fundamental values. And finally, disinformation and about the materialist ground to this. And I mean, how are we going to solve this? I'm terribly sorry to inform you that we have 7 minutes at our disposal. So I encourage the panelists now to you choose whichever you think you can provide the most interesting and compelling answer to. And also you have room for a final general reflection. Shall we start with you, Maximilian?
Thank you. Well, there are a couple of questions that I have no good answer to, so I'm just going to leave those. I love the first one. I love the last one. They go in the same direction. I mean, what's the utopian vision? I think the question that we also need to ask is, I mean, what is the utopian vision and what role does the EU get to play in this? I think this connects directly to this aspect of social Europe in the sense of, I mean, if I were to develop a utopian vision, the EU is not the organization that would be able to implement that simply because it doesn't have the competence to do so, because I mean, in terms of education, I mean, that's at the national or at the subnational level. So I mean, I guess for the EU, there's not much room to do anything other than, you know, to support measures like this and maybe to develop some kind of common vision about how to tackle this. I think it's a super important point about the socioeconomics of post-truth politics. I mean, that's a dimension that we clearly need to take into account. I think we have ample evidence from the 2016 presidential elections in the US that is not so much about, you know, that people that don't know, what sources they can trust and, you know, how do they assess information, but they just don't care simply because there are other concerns. So I love that comment about social Europe. Utopian vision, give everybody a job, give everybody enough to eat, give everybody a reasonable, standard of living, and then see to what extent that problem still exists. Having said that, I do believe that education plays a fundamental role here, and I'm saying this because, I mean, it seems like in this room or in other rooms where I've talked about this project, this isn't the problem. Like, everybody is aware of manipulation in the public sphere that takes place via social media and things like this, to some extent, you know, through technologies, but everybody knows how to deal with that. But not everybody does. In these rooms, yes. Elsewhere, no. So it is to some extent a question of education, and that's kind of what we need to tackle. And I think that's apart from the socioeconomic part. So this is kind of where this aspect of citizenship education comes in. But we need to be aware of this notion of socioeconomics plays a role in this.
Agnieszka, what's your favorite question of these?
There are quite a few to deal with. Maybe building up on what Maximilian was saying. Of course, the socioeconomic context, the understanding of these cleavages, understanding of where, like, what is the purpose also of disinformation, for example, right? Who's doing it and why, because sometimes it's quite intentional. One thing that I was thinking about is also the people who are indifferent, right? Because we have polarization, we have cleavages, but we also have those people who are somehow not thought about, right? Why do those issues not matter to them? Yeah, do they have other concerns? Is it due to socioeconomic factors, and so on and so on? Education, of course, since we are academics, I think this is one of the key elements for all of us in understanding democratic processes, understanding what the EU values really mean, also what is behind them. Is quite important. And this is also linked to the question about enlargement, right? That we can't compromise on certain sort of steps towards enlargement because precisely of preserving those values and so I think that's it from me for now.
Thank you. That's a great, brave attempt. Richard, where is your go?
Very briefly, just select 3 points. First, I agree with Funda that the global gateway is a really important question, because this could really make a difference to the EU's international influence, because it could mobilize a lot of money. The EU promises the global gateway as a democratic alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not clear to me what that really means. So it says the EU will invest in infrastructure in a way that furthers democratic rights, but it doesn't really explain how that will happen. Maybe somebody else has a better answer to me, but if the EU goes to Pakistan and says, don't take the Belt and Road Initiative money, we will build your ports and roads, how does that further democratic rights in a way that Chinese investment doesn't? So for me, there's some detail that needs to be fleshed out there. And if it is, it could make a big difference. Second, the questions on parliaments, parties, for me, are really interesting. It's true. 5 years ago, debates about democratic renewal are being focused on parties and parliaments. What's happened is there have been so many forms of citizens engaging in different forms of democratic engagement that parliaments and parties are getting a bit left out of the equation. There are many political scientists who actually want them to be left out of the equation. They say parties and parliaments are the past or the old forms of democracy. So for me, the key to answer Paul's question is we can invest in local forms of democratic activism, but they need to be connected much better to parliaments and parties if we're to have this more comprehensive institutional understanding of democracy. And then finally on accession, yes, it should be, I think we all probably all agree in this room that we need a different form of accession. There are people working on this, Frank and others have been advocating this. The trouble is you've got some member states now realizing accession with the 3 candidates now is a geopolitical process. They can't be left waiting for 20 years, but member states have got to make that happen. Otherwise you will get the institution saying that we can't move forward and that we have to wait for 20 years while Ukraine labels its bottles correctly, and things won't happen. So if it's going to be of strategic value, there's got to be the political will invested in it. As we've seen from Turkey, if that doesn't happen, then it won't have that strategic value.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think you all did a great job, a brave job in answering these questions. And I also thank you for engaging actively in this discussion, which is, of course, another one of those very broad and important issues. And I'm sure also that we have heard during the 2 sessions already that these questions, they will stay high on the agenda also during the Swedish EU presidency. We did not convey any strong messages to the Swedish EU presidency, but for sure this is something that the Union will need to work with over the years to come. With that said, I'm going to say a big thanks to Agnieszka Sadecka, Maximilian Konrad, and Richard Youngs for participating, and give them a warm hand.